In a world where nuclear war has begun, vampires fought back in super real 3D.
I have been hearing all the buzz about how the creator was shot on the Sony FX3. And indeed, it turns out that it was shot on the Sony FX3. I looked at trailers for this on YouTube and was pretty blown away. I thought it looked fantastic, okay? So I'm like all on board. I'm like, is this the Sony FX3? Like, I'm wondering. And then finally some information came out that indeed it was. But before I realized officially 100% that it was, I already knew that it was. If that sounds confusing enough. Because how do I know? How did I know for sure, even though I hadn't been reading up on it and following it, but Gareth Edwards did confirm this just a couple of weeks ago. Well, before I heard that, I went to go see Oppenheimer on Imax. And when I saw Oppenheimer, there was a preview for the creator. And when the preview for the creator came on, among all the other IMAX previews, because all the movies that I want to say, like every movie that there was a preview for, it was an IMAX ready film. I don't know, it wasn't necessarily shot on IMAX cameras, but they were all shot on other, obviously higher end cameras. This is a rare thing that the Sony FX3 was used for a camera of this, for a movie of this production level. And when it came on, I could tell. Now it looked great. Do not get me wrong. It absolutely looked phenomenal. It's amazing that the Sony FX3 was playing on an IMAX screen. But I could tell the difference. It was notable, and I even asked my son, who's just getting into cameras. He's 16 years old, and he could tell too. Like, because it was actually quite obvious. There's a very specific noise floor and pattern that the Sony cameras have. And you can see that noise pattern kind of running through certain shots. And overall, the tonality, like the actual definition and skin tones on some of the shots, I could just tell. I'm sound like a jerk right now. It was amazing that it was shot on this, but I'm just being point blank honest. I could tell that the skin was a little bit more, the colors were a little bit more muddled together. Like there wasn't as much detail. It was just a little bit more rounded off. It didn't quite have the gradation that some of the higher end cameras have. That would normally be used to film. There was a bug flying by, sorry. That would be used to film something like this. Now, did it look absolutely passable? It 100% did. It was phenomenal. It's going to look like, if you're watching it on TV, you definitely won't see the difference. I'd be surprised if we can see the difference carried over to TV. But I'm telling you, on the IMAX screen, I could see the difference. Now, when it went to Oppenheimer, that was shot on an actual IMAX film camera, because Christopher Nolan's one of the very few directors that still actually is, he will not film on digital, at least still for now. He's on film camera, same with Quentin Tarantino. And it just did look better. Now, one thing that I think that people are getting a little bit confused about, just to point out, is one of the things that makes an IMAX camera unique and an IMAX screen unique is that it is a different aspect ratio, and you're probably aware of that. It's more of a square than it is the traditional panoramic sensation of that 16 by 9 or 17 by 9 screen choice that you would have if you were filming traditional, cinema Super 35. But the thing is that you could crop off on the sides, and then you end up getting that square. And people are like, well, it's full frame, so it's the same as an IMAX. But that is not true, because an IMAX, for instance, the full size sensor of a full frame sensor on the Sony FX3 is roughly 36 by, I believe, 24 or 25 inches, 24 and a half inches. Whereas an IMAX film camera is in the ballpark of like 72 inches by 50 inches or 52 inches, somewhere like that. Okay, so that's a pretty dramatic difference in the size of the sensor. In digital sensor land, you have the RE65 millimeter, and that was a big deal that they stepped up to that plate. But that was a big deal. That camera was first introduced around the time that The Revenant came out. The first movie of theatrical release that had any footage using that new camera, because it was such a big deal, because it had such a huge sensor and it was a digital camera, was actually Mission Impossible. Gosh, I forget which one it was at that point. I think it was Mission Impossible 4. Was that Ghost Protocol? I'm getting them a little bit confused. The last few Mission Impossibles have all been amazing, but I I kind of forget which one's which a little bit because I've only seen them each once. But there was a scene in where he's going, Tom Cruise has to hold his breath and go underwater, and then there's like this big cylindrical type thing, and he's like, and that whole scene was filmed with RE65. That was the first theatrical footage that was put out and tested in theaters with it. But immediately following that was The Revenant, which was this amazing film, and it looked phenomenal. You could see and feel the difference of just the absolute immersiveness of this huge sensor, and it felt like it was IMAX, but it was a digital camera, so they were able to move around a lot more freely, and it looked phenomenal. The dynamic range is great. I'm getting a little bit off track here. My point is that the Sony FX3 sensor, just because it's full frame, that is not the equivalent of the aspect ratio and the actual sensor size that is in a true IMAX camera, nor is it as big as the RE65, for instance, which is trying to get closer to that 70 millimeter feel. I mean, you were talking about a 70 millimeter sensor for the IMAX film cameras. We're talking about 65 millimeter for the RE65 millimeter, and then we're talking about a 36 millimeter size sensor when you get full frame. So it's great, it's amazing, but you know, I feel like you can kind of feel the difference when it goes to that. And I don't know how much, there is something, if you go see Oppenheimer and you're watching that IMAX thing, there's certain shots where it's like, that feels so IMAX, like, because it's just so big, even though it's not an action scene, it's just like a scene in a courtroom or something like that. It's just like the tallness of it and the big, it's just, you can't quite achieve that in the same way on a 35 millimeter sensor, which is ultimately what the FX3 is. Now, I like Sony. I've had Sonys. I've still got my original Sonys. I've kind of transitioned more to Canon, and I also have a Red. Do I understand why Greg Fraser is actually the DP on the Creator, as far as I understand it? He's definitely the one that helped film Rogue One, and him and Gareth Edwards team up pretty regularly. I'm pretty sure it's Greg Fraser that's also filmed the Creator. Why would you go to a camera like that for such a big budget film? I think it's a really exciting idea to have such a small camera that you can put in so many different situations, and I know that the low light performance of a camera like that is fantastic. That is super cool. It is completely different than if you were filming on film, for sure. In particular, a lot of digital cameras can get to higher low light ability. The Sony is kind of revered as the low light king, and when apparently he was even taking advantage of the 12,800 ISO that you can hit, that basically is really clean on the FX3. However, I want to say once you get past 4,000 ISO or 3,200 ISO, somewhere in there, once you get past that on the Sony FX3, from there all the way up to the 12,800, to me, I've got tests. I put up a video about this, might have even been the last video I did, ironically, where there's a guy that demonstrates what that noise pattern looks like on the Canon R5 C leading up to the 12,800 versus the FX3. It might have been a Sony A7S III. I'm sorry, guys, but that is the same sensor, so it doesn't really matter. And honestly, the R5C, it looked better all the way up to 12,800. I know you guys might argue with that, but I'll put the link in this video too, so you can check out this dude's video doing it. And you just tell me. I think that the noise pattern looks better. It's less noticeable. It's cleaner. The colors are actually better, which is amazing. Once you get to 12,800 though, that thing's clean as a whistle on the FX3 by comparison, and going upward, you're going to continue to beat the Canon hands down. I bring up the Canon R5C because I have it, and because I was deciding between it or an FX3, and the reasons that I went with the Canon R5C and do not regret it is because it offers 8K RAW internal filming, and the RAW is absolutely amazing. The Sony FX3 does not offer RAW, and it is only 4K. So you're going to have a compressed codec. You're stuck to 10-bit color, unless you're using an external recorder, which at that point, you're kind of getting more into the territory of why not just get a larger camera to begin with that offers that in it. Do you need RAW all the time? Well, I'll just tell you, every time I use it, I don't regret it. I mean, especially if it's something important, I go to RAW, and every time I'm happy I did. It's crazy how much you can crop in on it, but it's also just like absolutely gorgeous. The color and everything with the Canon is just unbelievable. Both these cameras are currently roughly at the same price point. That's why I'm bringing this up. A lot of people are probably going to buy a Sony FX3 if they've just heard and seen the Creator. If they hear about the Creator and stuff, they're going to go Sony FX3. Just keep in mind, Canon and Sony do have a slightly different look. I love both of them. I do feel like you can get them to match incredibly well. There's a lot of tests out there. You can get it to look just like the FX3 if you wanted to, but you also have a different look available to it. I think the Sony offers itself during the color grading process to a slightly different end look as well. But I'm telling you, if you're toying around with the RAW versus the compressed codec, the RAW is going to beat it. There just is no doubt about it. The only edge that you're getting with the Sony ultimately beyond the low light performance past 12,000 or at 12,800 and beyond is also that it does have better dynamic range slightly. Now, I was a dynamic range junkie, and that's why I have a red. You know, it has 16.5 stops of dynamic range. And I was just chasing that all day long. I thought that would be the creme de la creme of creating the best image possible. That is the sign of an absolute better looking camera. If it has more dynamic range and it's got good color, I'm in. I'd rather have that than high resolution. And that can be true. However, I've been blown away at how good the dynamic range actually is in the R5C when using RAW, because you do get an extra bump of dynamic range. It goes up to 12.5 stops. And that's rated by, I believe that was achieved by Gerald Undone, who does some of the most detailed analysis and breakdowns of cameras. If you are looking for getting into the absolute tech spec king, in my opinion, on YouTube, Gerald Undone is that guy. And he was able to get, I believe, if I remember correctly, this was a year ago when I was shopping at the camera and trying to decide between these two, it was 12.5 stops. The Sony, I do not think actually achieves 14 stops, even though it claims that. I want to say that it's like 13.5 or something, so slightly less. This is not that big of a difference, and I would rather have the RAW. The RAW 12-bit color is unbelievable. The ability to crop in, I just cannot believe how good it looks when I go all the way zoomed in at 200%. So my personal, I do not regret getting the R5C personally. And keep in mind, if everyone's going to go out and buy the Sony FX3, you might want the ability to create a slightly different look. So you might just think about the Canon. I don't care if you get the Canon. Hey, give me the look. I'll stick with the look. I might get Sony's again one day too. I like all of it. But right now, currently, if those cameras are at the same price point, if you start looking at the specs, because I think that the Canon R5C, it kind of trumps it. It just does. And not trying to get political here, so don't take that out of context. I'm just saying to me, it's a better camera. So that is my opinion on it. And I'm telling you, if you get to see, you go see Oppenheimer, take note of it. If you get to see the preview for the creator, just compare it to the other previews of the other movies and Oppenheimer. And I'm just telling you, when it comes on, you can't see it in every scene. Some scenes are like just spot on, but there's a lot of visual effects added to this movie. There's a lot of cleanup that's happened, and I still don't quite know if they were running external recorders or if they elected to do that at certain times, because one thing that the FX3 does offer is 16-bit RAW. Yeah, it's RAW, 16-bit RAW, with an external recorder option. It's still going to be 4K, but that sounds really enticing and nice, and I'm sure that it's beautiful, but you are getting into an external recorder and recording media for that and batteries for that and rigging, and it just gets bigger and bigger. If you're looking for a compact unit and take advantage of this lightweight experience that it is with the mirrorless, so much so that I have been, it's kind of crazy how I am using my R5C more than my Red for the last few months, because it's just such a joy to use by comparison, because it is so light and get it in all these situations. It works so well for the run and gun. The battery situation that I've set up for it, even though it's been criticized for having weak batteries, I do have a very small, modest little handheld rig. It's still very compact, and it does have an extra battery on it. It's not getting over the top, and it's not like having a full external recorder and extra batteries for that. And it runs like practically all day. I only have to change batteries once, so that's really not an issue for me. I will say, there is one more advantage to the Sony, and it probably does have better autofocus. However, just so you know, the R5C recently released Canon recently released a firmware update for the Canon R5C that does improve the autofocus performance. So if you're watching older videos giving examples of the Canon R5C, it's not necessarily accurate. I have been using the new firmware. I just made a video about it. You can check it out, and I'm talking about this directly, but ultimately it It is a lot stickier. I'm getting better autofocus performance for sure. And it also can recognize the back of heads now if you're doing tracking, which before it didn't. So that is a big advantage. So it's gotten a lot better. And I mean, you can do the 8K up to 60 frames per second, which I very, very rarely use. And by the way, all the footage that I've shown on here, all that 8K raw light is raw light. It's not even the heaviest codec that it can film in. It can go even higher quality on the raw, and I just don't even use it because the raw light is already crazy good. I do use the 4K XFAVC as well, and it is great. I've been blown away at how good it performs. I think it is right there with the Sony FX3 and its compressed codec. So anyway, do consider both cameras. I just want you to know that there are options. If you get the FX3, beautiful, amazing camera. I think it's fantastic that Gareth Edwards has signed off on the idea of Greg Fraser using a camera like this for their movie. I think it's amazing. It's a huge milestone. The last movie that I can think of that was like a big deal, that it was shot on DSLRs at the time, was a movie called Act of Valor. And I believe it only used Canon Mark IIs at that time. And that was a really big deal. It was a military movie, and it was like all shot on there. And I remember going and seeing it, and I remember, as cool as it was, I could definitely tell that it was filmed on the Mark IIs. It looked really good, but it was a lot softer, a whole lot softer. The colors were a lot more muddled together. I think that's one of the things. There's something about the depth and gradation, the depth of the image overall and the gradation of colors in a camera like that, in a FX3 even, trying to hold up on a screen that's of this size and this much detail is being shown. Do keep in mind, 4K, even though the projectors are digital that they're being played on in most Imax screenings, at 4K, you'd think, well, if it's 4K, it's 4K, but we know how good downsampling is. So it's the last rant I'll give you on the Canon. The reason that the 4K XFAVC looks so good, it is being downsampled from an 8K sensor, and that's why I actually think it has an edge over the Sony FX3 footage that's just straight off of a 4K sensor. When you're talking about an IMAX filmed movie on film, there's, depending on how it's scanned and processed at the end, it can be anywhere from 12 to 18K resolution. So that when you downsample from that to a 4K projection image, there's just going to be a difference. It is notable. There is a pristineness to it that's there. So anyway, just that was one more point to make. Guys, have fun out there. By the way, I do have a show that I've been making. It's a web series. It's super campy. I'm in a rock band called Cue the Muses, and we make it's a sci-fi scripted comedy, and in each episode is an epic music video off of our album that has not been fully released yet. We're unveiling it one episode at a time with one song in each episode. We think it's a really original way to do it. It's super fun. The songs are mega huge, and we have different singers on every song from different bands throughout the Southeast. So it's a really, really exciting project. I've gotten to cut my teeth on a lot of stuff, growing with it as a filmmaker and as somebody that actually just makes videos for companies for a living, along with making music videos for other artists. You can follow along on my channel if you are interested in learning about cameras, editing, and all that kind of stuff, and you just want to hear rants about this kind of stuff because it's super fun. All right, I hope you have a great night. Take care, and I hope to catch you around on another episode. Peace.
We're not fighting to bring back only humanity's creative forces, but the muses as well. One song will not suffice, gentlemen. We need 4, a full rock EP.
Okay, man, on my 3 count, engage your pedal for transport. 1, 2, 3.
Ash.
Dick?